There is such a thing called Christian Science. And I want to be clear at the outset, it is not the same thing as Scientology. But Christian Science, if you've ever heard of them, you have heard of them as those people that refuse medical treatment and only go to, they never go to doctors, and they pray for those to be healed. But is that what Christian Science really is? I'm very fortunate today. I am joined by Linda Kramer, who was raised in the Christian Science movement and knew it very well for many, many years, over 30 years, and eventually left and is here to tell her story. But I want to thank you first for listening to the Sin Boldly radio program. We also put this out as a podcast, and you can find that at our church's website. You can email me through the church's website. You can find all that at felchouston.org, felchouston.org. This show is if you've never caught it before, it's generally Christian apologetics. We look at trends in the church. We look at Christian apologetics issues, everything from philosophy. We've done 3 of the big cults this month. So Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, and Christian Science. And like I said, today I'm very lucky to be joined by someone who is really very steeply involved with Christian Science. Learn more about KPFT. If you're listening to this right now, you're listening to it on the HD2 channel. But learn more about KPFT if you're listening to this through the podcast at kpft.org. kpft.org. You can learn how to become a member of the radio station there. You can make a pledge, you can make a donation, and we got a winter pledge drive coming up. We want to keep that as short as possible, as always, and keep it all about the programming. So do check out kpft.org. It's the only radio station in Houston, I can guarantee you, that would let me have a radio show like this. So I'm always very thankful to be here. Okay, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest. Her name is Linda Kramer. She has a Ph.D. in chemistry. She worked in the corporate field in chemistry for a long time, has also taught, and also owns her business now. She is the author of a book you can find on Amazon called Perfect Peril, Christian Science and Mind Control. Linda, are you there?
Yes, hi.
It is okay if I call you Linda, right?
Oh, please do.
With a Ph.D., I feel somewhat obligated to call you Dr. Kramer. But
No.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me. We have a mutual friend, and I was so glad to be able to get you on the show to really get a first-hand perspective of Christian Science. Like I said at the outset, I do want to make it clear that when we speak about Christian Science, it's not the same thing as Scientology. That is a completely different issue altogether, although I'm sure there may be some overlap. But we are talking about a more historic cult, if you will, that goes back into the mid-19th century, founded by Mary Baker Eddy, and it is still around today, though declining, like all the rest of us, I guess, but certainly some precipitous declines in the last 30, 40 years, etc. But what I would like to do is just kind of set the stage here. What is Christian Science? A lot of Christians really aren't aware of it. The only thing they think they know about Christian Science is that it's those people who are so dedicated to the faith that they refuse medical treatment because they believe that God will miraculously heal. And so the only time we really hear about Christian Science in the news is when there's a lawsuit or a child dies because there was no medical treatment. So I'd like to just kind of lay the groundwork here. What is Christian Science? Who is Mary Baker Eddy? And what are kind of the main, tenets or belief systems within Christian Science?
Okay, Mary Baker Eddy was, in 1866, she fell on the ice and claimed to have a healing in 3 days that sent her to the Bible, and she began trying to understand the biblical basis of healing. How did Jesus heal? And basically she came to the conclusion that God doesn't heal your physical body, but because of the first chapter of Genesis, it says God created everything good and man in his image. If God is good and God is a spirit, then there is no such thing as matter. And so when if you cut your hand and if you were most anybody else and you were going to pray for healing of your hand, you would pray, God, please heal my hand. But in Christian Science, you would say, no, I understand that in reality, although I seem to have a physical body and I seem to live in a physical world, those are really a misconception. And as I understand that I'm truly the perfect spiritual, holy spiritual, not physical at all, perfect idea of God, I don't have a physical hand to be harmed in the first place. As you understand your true relationship to God as His reflection, your understanding will be reflected in the fact that you will, your experience will change, or you'll see your true experience, and you realize you don't have a physical hand to be cut, and it'll be manifested in a healing. So the difference between Christian Science and a lot of other religions is the Christian scientists are working to know the unreality of the physical experience they seem to be in. So it's a completely different mindset.
Well, let's just stop there, because that is so important, and it's right here at the outset, which I think is good. I think we need to just make sure that there's clarity about it, and our listeners understand the difference. By the way, I should have given the phone number to the studio. I always forget to do that. So if anyone's out there and would like to call in, we can take callers. 713-526-8737 is the number to the studio. 713-526-8737. Don't be bashful. Feel free to give a call. Okay, so let's say, for example, that we just had a debate at our church, actually, on the charismatic gifts, which I believe have ceased. That is the gifts of, say, faith healing, tongues, prophecy, things like that. Those three in particular, but faith healing in particular. Okay, now there are Christians, Pentecostals, charismatics, etc., who believe that, say, faith healing, goes on. You see the kind of more extreme examples where Benny Hinn is knocking people over with his sport coat, and they fall back and they're healed. And but you also have much more modest examples where a Christian will pray for someone's cancer to go away, or something like that. I mean, I've known people who have done that and believe that they had a gift to heal, not on demand, but a kind of special dispensation to pray for that sort of thing. Okay. That is very different from what you described Christian Science. In the first case, where, say, someone is praying for healing, or you have a charismatic who believes they can faith heal, okay? In that case, we're dealing with someone who acknowledges that the body is real, that the cancer is real, and that if left to its own devices, the cancer will consume the body and kill the body, even though the person will live on in a spiritual place before the resurrection. Now, Christian Science does not believe that. So stop on that a little bit and just, explain that one more time, because I think it's so critical that people understand this difference.
In Christian Science, there is no cancer because there is no physical body.
So
you think you have cancer because you're believing in the material experience. You're believing in the reality of matter. Therefore, you're opening the door to the false belief of the cancer. So in Christian Science, you're not praying to heal the cancer. You're praying. You're praying to understand that there is no cancer. One time, in one of the writings of, I think it's a We Know Mary Baker Eddy series. It was a series of accounts by people who were part of her inner circle, and someone had. There was a comment that God has no use for a diseased body, and Mary Baker Eddy said, "Can you tell me, what's wrong with that statement?" And the bottom line, what's wrong with the statement is God has no use for any material body, well or diseased. There is no material body. So that's very different from if I have enough faith, God will heal my body.
Right. And we might agree that there are multiple approaches to healing that are wrong, but in this case, what strikes us as so strange, and I don't think Christians really understand this about Christian Science, is that there is a fundamental denial then of reality. I mean, you have two people in corporal form speaking to one another. Their voice box is vibrating. They can touch one another, and yet, is there really the belief that it really is all, an illusion? Does it go that far? Is just saying
you're trying to understand that it really is an illusion. You obviously you haven't completely understood it, because here you are existing in what seems to be the reality. But a Christian Scientist, as they increasingly understand the true spiritual nature of everything, their experience will be reflected in a better experience. For instance, if you seem to be in poverty, you can demonstrate supply. If you seem to be sick, you'll be healthier because you're understanding that the sickness isn't real. So here's an example of a conversation I used to have with people when I was a Christian Scientist. Somebody comes up and they say, "Oh my goodness, you're sniffing. I'm sorry to see you have a cold." Well, as a Christian Scientist, you're not going to say to this non-Christian Scientist, "Well, I don't really have a cold. I don't really have a material body to have a cold." You might talk, "Thank you very much for noticing," or whatever. But as you're speaking on the material plane to this person, in your mind, you're denying the existence of the body to have the cold. I'm God's perfect child. I can, in reality, do not have a cold. So you're talking on one plane, and you're knowing the truth, as they say, on a different plane. So you're really existing in two realities at once. The reality of talking to the person with that we're talking to,
right,
and the spiritual reality that there isn't really a physical body to be talking to.
Well, I have two thoughts about that, one of which we'll come to later, I think. But the first is that sounds completely exhausting.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, wow. The second is that the amount of harm that can be done with that, especially regarding children, and I do want to get to that later, but it just seems remarkable, and not just the physical harm of denying an illness or a pain or something like that, but the emotional harm of the development of a child. But so Mary Baker Eddy, so she claims to have had this is a very seminal experience of hers, right, where she slips on the ice and she falls, and she is hurt, and so she claims a healing. Now, I don't know if it's worth mentioning or helpful or not, but I have read that she was unhappy with the city for the state of the sidewalk or something like that.
Yes, she had this miraculous spiritual healing. She was supposed to die, but she rose from her bed healed and free. But a few years later, or maybe 6 months later, she tried to sue the city for damages. On the grounds that she was still suffering. So it wasn't exactly the seminal experience that later became in the folklore.
One can imagine Jesus filing lawsuit against Pontius Pilate, or something for the.
That would have certainly made the headlines.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, she wasn't alone. I mean, there was a kind of a grouping of these sort of cults, or what we would call mind science cults. I guess her sort of outlived all the rest. And
her spawned some of them. There was a sort of a pool of thinking in the late 1800s, lots of spiritual testing the waters, and there's a mindset of, here's a new experience, here's a new theory, let's try this. And a lot of the prosperity gospel, a lot of the other mind sciences like religious science and New Thought and things like that all sort of come from the same origin, the same mode of thinking.
Yeah. Okay. So she ends up with quite her book, by the way, is it's parallel to the Bible in Christian Science, which is Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. So any Christian Scientist practically has that book memorized, probably, right? I mean, it's something that is read again and again and studied weekly. Is that right?
What happens is there's a secret committee at the Mother Church in Boston, which is the headquarters, that puts together a series of readings every week. It's called the Lesson Sermon, and it'd be passages from the Bible on a certain topic and correlative passages from Science and Health. So they give you passages to read, and you read them all week, and then they're read. Then there's two readers in the church, one who reads the Bible, the other reads Science and Health. And so the sermon on a Sunday is the first and second readers reading the series of passages that were given out ahead of time that everybody's been studying all week. So what you get is a lot of cherry-picked verses, both from Science and Health and the Bible, and a lot of half verses, a lot of Bible verses that end at the semicolon, and then you switch to something else. So you can really make the Bible say anything you want, or say anything you want, if you cherry pick portions of sentences.
One of my questions was going to be, what is the relationship to the Bible? Because in all the cases of all these cults, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, they either have their own translation, they cherry pick bad translations. I mean, and none of them, because they all want to claim to be Christian or some new reincarnation of Christianity, or Christianity finally gotten right. They can't just throw away the scriptures. So I mean,
Yes.
I'm guessing they don't do expositional preaching, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, or even they don't use a lectionary like in our tradition we do. So, are texts sort of appointed from on high then, and they?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's literally published it's called the Quarterly. It's published in a book, and you know that there is a series of topics that get repeated twice a year, and the readings will be on those topics like God, or is the universe, including man, evolved by atomic force, or just various topics. And so this committee sets up this set of readings, and all the readers can do is read what's written for them. The Bible, the thought in Christian Science is that the disciples weren't they were called, Mrs. Arity called them dull disciples, that people lost the science behind healing, that Jesus knew the science behind healing. He demonstrated it through his healing. He only seemed to die on the cross, but his overcoming the seeming death proved the unreality of sin, sickness, and death. But somehow that lesson didn't get passed on to his followers, so Mary Baker Eddy rediscovered the science behind healing. So Christian Science, Science and Health, the textbook, it illuminates what the Bible says. So they read the Bible, but then Science and Health reinterprets it. For instance,
go ahead.
God, Jesus, heaven, hell, judgment, any of those things have a different, quote, spiritualized meaning in Christian Science that absolutely changes the meaning of what the Bible is trying to say.
Yeah, so I mean, we would I mean, obviously, Christian Science we would say is not Christianity, because so many of the basic pillars of Christianity are just redefined. I mean,
right.
who God is, who Jesus was, the Trinity, the nature of reality.
The nature of reality, yeah.
It doesn't get any bigger than that.
Didn't really die on the cross because there was really no material cross to be dying on.
Let me ask two more theological questions. I want to go back to Genesis because it's interesting in my former tradition. I used to be in a Lutheran denomination that is now very liberal, theologically progressive or liberal. And Genesis 1, they love to quote Genesis 1 to say, well, listen, this would in particular, for example, dealing with say homosexuality. Well, listen, God doesn't make junk, right? They would say, look at Genesis 1. God made everything, and he saw that it was good. And this is how God made me. It must be good. And I thought, well, yeah, just read another 2 chapters, though, and we have the fall, okay, where all that God made that was good is now corrupted by the fall. So where does the fall come into play with Christian Science? Because if you want to appeal to Genesis 1, I think it's fine in terms of understanding God's goodwill for the creation. But to understand reality, you have to read Genesis 3 as well. But
in Christian Science, Genesis 3 is an allegory. It's not real.
Okay.
So everything after Genesis 1 has to be reinterpreted. So there is no fall. In Christian Science, you're saved not from hell, not from your sinful nature. You're saved from your belief in materiality. So if a Christian Scientist, and you're using the same words, but they have different meanings. So here's the phrase: Jesus Christ died for our sins. You and I, as biblical Christians, would say Jesus truly died on the cross to pay for our sins and to repair a breach in our relationship with God. Does that make sense?
Yep.
In Christian Science, they would say Jesus only seemed to die, but he rose again, and his seeming death proved the unreality of sin, sickness, and death, and proved that there is no breach in the true man's relationship with God.
Yeah. Wow.
So it's an absolutely different interpretation of the phrase.
Well, that gets me to the second question I wanted to ask, and it reminds me of a couple of years ago, a friend of one of our members who is Christian Science but struggles with it, had a close friend or family member who died. And I learned at that time, I didn't know this at the time, but I guess in her Christian Science congregation, or in any of them, there are no funeral services, or what we would think of as a funeral service. And I guess there can't be, because then that would pretend that something is real that isn't, which is a person died. Okay. So tell me about death in Christian Science, and I guess, a funeral rite, or why there can't be a funeral rite, or what would take its place?
Death, there is no true death in Christian Science because there's no body to die, but there's planes of understanding. So when you die, as we would say, you're passing to a different plane of consciousness is what it is. And any problems or any misconceptions you had in this plane of existence, you still have them in the next plane. So you still have to work out the problem of the belief in the materiality. So, and you're going to have to keep doing that. It's not reincarnation because there's no physical body involved, but you eventually have to work out your own salvation and understanding the true spiritual nature of everything.
Yeah.
So eventually everybody will be, quote, saved, and it's being saved from their belief in materiality. Does that make sense?
So
I mean, do you understand?
I understand.
So in a Christian Science, there are memorial services. They don't have the casket and all that sort of thing.
Okay.
But and the memorial services tend to downplay the death. They may have readings from Science and Health, or they may have, I knew a mother who died, and so for her funeral service, the talk was on the spiritual nature of motherhood. Didn't have anything to do with the woman dying. It discussed the spiritual nature of motherhood, and so they're uplifting your thought to help you understand the woman's true spiritual nature. They're to help you lift your thought above the seeming death. So to a Christian Scientist, that might be uplifting, but to anybody who isn't, they come away from the funeral going, wait a minute, I thought we were having a funeral.
Right.
It's just very, very different, and it varies. I know of Christian Science homes where there's nothing happens. Everything is denied, and I know of services that are had, but still they're very different from the services that you and I would attend in our church.
Yeah, of course, it is interesting, and having done funerals and always hobnobbing with the funeral home directors. Pastors and funeral home directors always have something to talk about. But it's interesting, even in Orthodox Christianity, how I believe we are moving away from what the funeral is. We have celebrations of life. I had a pastor who gave a talk. He's a part-time funeral home director and a part-time pastor, and he gave a talk about the funeral sort of practices in the Lutheran tradition and all that. And he talked about how he attended a funeral at I think it was an Episcopal church, and the title of the sermon was "The Wonder That Was Sandra." And so it was a sermon all about this amazing person, about the wonder that was Sandra, and she was just this amazing. And I don't know. I mean, I do think that we should remember a person's life. We should even celebrate their life. We should thank God for giving us this person and all of that. But in the end, what we need to hear at a funeral is that death is a terrible thing. It was not part of God's intentional creation, and yet we fell into sin, so death is our punishment. But Jesus has died for that death, and there is a response to that death that we can offer. So I do worry, even within Orthodox Christianity, that we lack confidence in the gospel. And we even are falling into the same temptation of Christian Science, which is a denial of death. I don't even know that we call them funerals anymore. So
it comes down to whether one is willing to acknowledge the need for salvation.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to acknowledge that, then you're going to avoid it because you don't want to think about the question of was this person, quote, saved or not.
Right.
And so you just avoid it by having a celebration of life. There's nothing wrong with having a celebration of life, but you better use the opportunity to acknowledge what really happened and hopefully if this person did receive the gospel,
right?
Say it, let people know.
And by the way, I can say that the most freedom I have in proclaiming, I shouldn't say that like that, but I mean, funerals are fantastic places. I mean, with the casket right there and the dead body right there, fantastic places and opportunities to preach the gospel because, of what Jesus has done for us. But let me give the phone number out again, 713-526-8737. Who knows, someone out there listening may be Christian Science or former Christian Science, might want to offer their thoughts. Please do call in. We'll be glad to get you on the air, and as long as you're kind and you have a good question. But 713-526-8737 is the number, and check out kpft.org if you're listening to this, and see what all kinds of cool stuff they do and learn more about KPFT there. Again, you're listening to the Sin Boldly radio program. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor over at First Evangelical Lutheran Church, and I'm very fortunate to be joined tonight by Dr. Linda Kramer, who was in Christian Science for about 30 years. And actually, let's get into that, Linda. How long did you grow up in Christian Science, if I remember that correctly, or...
Yes, I did. I was born into a Christian Science family. My mother her family had converted when she was 4, so she essentially grew up in it. My dad had converted as a young naval officer during World War II. His skipper on his submarine was a Christian Scientist. So my dad actually converted aboard a submarine. And so my grandparents on my mother's side were CS. My dad's were not. But I had a brother and sister, and we were all raised in Christian Science. My brother never bought into it. My sister and I both went to there's a Christian Science college in Illinois called Principia College, and so we both went to that college, and I loved Christian Science. I loved my college. We were Navy, so we moved all over the place, and there's a uniformity in Christian Science churches and sermons, going back to what I talked about with the readings that everybody all over the world reads. So Christian Science was not only my spiritual basis, but it was my kind of my emotional roots, because as we moved around the country, we would run into people that we met in other Christian Science churches who were also in the military who would move. And then when I went to this college, there were people from all through my upbringing from all over the country that were also coming to this college. So it was a wonderful sense of roots to me, and I just really enjoyed the college. I was honest enough in my heart to know that I wasn't the, quote, healer that I wanted to be. In other words, a lot of Christian Scientists, if you expect to be, if you pray about a cold or whatever, and you've got a healing, a lot of them think everything is a Christian Science healing, and so they've had thousands of healings and all that. I was honest enough with myself to realize I didn't have that many that I could really put my finger on. So when I had a child, I married a non-practicing Lutheran who was willing to go to church with me. But when we had a child, I realized I needed to be a better healer because I didn't want to get myself in the position you were referring to, where I put my child in danger by not getting a healing and not getting the care that he might need, whatever that care would be, spiritual or physical. So I started reading the Bible just without Christian Science. I just started reading it straight through in the New Testament, and I was really searching for truth, whatever truth is. And along about that time, a family came into my life that were Christians, but the wife had a physical problem, and I offered them Christian Science as a method for healing this, and that opened up a conversation. And over the months, the things they talked about, Jesus dying for our sins and sin being real, and there's a real heaven and a real hell, and all that stuff, I thought, this is so kindergarten. Christian Scientists think that they have sort of, the analogy I use is the graduate school of Christianity, where everybody else is the kindergarten, because Christian Science gives a spiritual interpretation. So I thought, the things they're saying are, they're cutesy, but they're kindergarten. And they just told me to keep reading. And several months later, I was reading in Romans, and I had switched to a modern translation because in CS we always use the King James Version, but trying to go through Romans in the King James Version is a little much. So I switched to a new translation, and I came across Romans 3:23-25, and it says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by His grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forth as a propitiation by His blood, or a sacrifice by His blood, to be received by faith." And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had never seen that passage before, and I realized that all these cutesy little things my friends were saying were actually in the Bible. I was like, why have I not seen this before? Well, and I realized that all have sinned. We fall short of the glory of God. We're justified as a gift through the blood of Jesus. It was shocking to me. And that moment changed my life forever. And I went through this 6-week, I call it a boot camp experience, where God kept bringing up one by one all the doctrines of Christianity. What is God? Who is God? What is Jesus? Is there heaven? Is there hell? What is salvation? All these things that we would consider core beliefs in Christianity, I had to go through each one of them and compare the Bible and Christian Science. And each time I found that Christian Science did not illuminate or further explain, but it actually contradicts what the Bible says. So I had to come to the place where I made a decision: am I going to believe the Bible for what it says, or am I going to believe the Christian Science interpretation of the Bible? And I chose the Bible. So at that point, and that was actually 1985, at that point I left Christian Science, and my friends who I had been talking to invited me to church, and I've actually been going to that church ever since.
Oh, okay. So you're still at the same church. What, if you don't mind my asking, what denomination or tradition is it?
It's a Baptist church, and Baptist, there's a whole range of Baptists. It's on the more conservative side. It's a Bible-believing Baptist church. We're very, very concerned about sticking to what the Word of God really says. Well,
that's great. I mean, again, boy, so many thoughts, and there's more to the story, and I definitely want to get there. But it's interesting that here you are, you're Christian, you believe as a Christian Science, you're Christian, and you have a high view of the Bible, and et cetera, et cetera. But when someone else can select what passages are relevant to you or relevant to this thing you endorse, it's pretty amazing what people can do, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Something as critical as Romans 3. I mean, how could you not? Christians need to be familiar with as much of Romans as possible, but certainly Romans 3. I mean, every Reformation Sunday in our tradition, we always read the great, that passage from Romans, which elucidates the gospel so clearly. But you see then the sort of control that's exercised in the selection of the Bible reading. So it's amazing what happened in your life just through reading the scriptures. So,
and letting them speak for themselves, because if, as a Christian Scientist, you read "for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God," you would reinterpret that as "for all seem to have sinned and seem to fall short of the glory of God," but in reality, they're not. They're the perfect spiritual ideas of God. So you have to be willing to let the Bible say what it's saying without your filters.
Yeah. Well, and that's that's a process of discernment. I often have, when I teach Sunday school, and we do apologetics conversations regularly, and people always ask, well, sort of, how do you know, what happens when people disagree, and how do you know what the Bible's really saying? I say, listen, once you become a Christian, and once you agree that the Bible is the Word of God, you will spend the rest of your life doing discernment. It'll never be over. I mean, you might,
right.
you might settle on some passages. You might come to understand that this text says this, and I'm really pretty certain of that. But you're always going to have other texts to examine, and you just better put on your seatbelt and realize that. I mean, that's just part of life as a Christian. But okay, so now one of the conversations we've had as we've looked at the various cults is we have made a distinction between a theological cult and a psychological or a sociological cult. And I think that the truth with Mormonism and Jehovah's Witness is that if you hear the stories of those who have left, there are definite psychological and sociological pulls to stay, and there's often isolation after you've left. Now, we all already understand that Christian Science is a theological cult because it's a variation of Christianity that differs from Orthodox Christianity. So I'm guessing in 1985, when you let friends and family know that you were leaving the Christian Science Church, that they just said, "Oh, okay, well, see you later." See you at the picnic over the weekend, right?
It's traumatic because it's leaving a worldview. It's leaving an entire way of thinking, a way of interpreting the world. It was very, very difficult. And although you may have friends, there's always going to be a tension because you've basically you've left the fold. You feel like a traitor. You feel, because you've been raised to think that you were the graduate school of Christianity, not their words, but my analogy.
Right.
I grew up thinking that anybody who left Christian Science, quote, just didn't understand it. And so here I am. Now I'm doing the thing that I used to sort of poo-poo other people for doing, gently pat them on the head and say, oh, they just didn't understand. And here I am doing that same thing, so I knew what people were thinking of me. So the whole thing felt like betraying, and it felt like sort of jumping down off a pedestal, and it was lonely. I was terribly lonely for the church, and as I'd said, it was a lot of my roots were the church because we'd moved around so much.
It was the normal thing in your life.
Extremely lonely.
Yeah.
Even though I was in a new, vibrant church, Bible-believing church, the Bible passages and hymns that had been tweaked, that had been used in Christian Science, when there'd be a hymn that I recognized the words or the music, it all just brought up a great homesickness. So it was, and I knew I'd broken my parents' heart, and it was just really difficult.
And let me add, this is a bit of an interjection, but when we encounter, that is, those of us in the church, encounter someone who has left a situation like yours, what should we do? How do we help in a situation like that?
One is to realize that they may be hurting, and to let them hurt. Don't try to solve their problem for them. I had once when I was visiting a church with a friend, and I just sort of broke down, and so one of their assistant pastors took me into a room and just sort of spewed Bible at me for 45 minutes and thought he'd help me, and I was just crushed because that's not what I didn't need to hear tons of Bible verses. I needed to talk about what I was feeling.
Yeah.
So listen to them, allow them to have their feelings. And in Christian Science, and a lot of cults, you're not allowed to say what you're really thinking because you're trying to maintain this sort of facade of spirituality. Right,
or deny reality.
Reality. Christian Scientists don't know how to deal with death, so you can make them very uncomfortable by saying, I'm so sorry that your uncle died. But and they can't express necessarily that their uncle died, but you can make them comfortable, make it so that they know you're comfortable if they want to express feelings about their uncle dying.
Yeah.
So be a safe place for them. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, very, very much so. And that we need to hear that, because I think that, a lot of us don't know how to deal with people who have left situations like that or have that in their background, and we're just not aware. We think, oh, okay, well, they found the light and everything's all better now. Or, if they're upset, we want to preach at them and teach at them until they're better. And, that goes beyond just sort of counter cult ministry. I mean, that's just normal pastoral care, as well in more normal situations. But
you need to realize that they've essentially left their country. They've left their culture. They've left their roots. Their closest friends. Their closest spiritual allies. They're probably being judged by people just because they're no longer on the same spiritual wavelength. So they've lost the deep emotional connections that they've had to the people they've always had around them.
Right.
So really, they're very much in like coming into a new country and having no one.
Right. Not even speaking the language, So,
right. You don't even speak the language. And as in my case, there were certain Bible passages as I was working through my stuff. There were certain Bible passages that would just really set me off because they were very key in Christian Science, and I had to accept a new interpretation of them, and they would remind me of where I came from. And so there may be things that trigger emotions in somebody who's come out of one of these situations, and you might think, that's ridiculous. But you have to realize that they're coming from a place that you're not familiar with, and just let them have their emotions and let them talk about it.
Well, that amazed me as a part of your story. And by the way, we need to make sure that if people want to learn more about you, they want to read your story, and anyway, learn more about former Christian scientists who have become Christian, christianway.org is a great website, and you can find Linda's story there, christianway.org. But what amazed me in reading your story is that even years after having left the church, having found a good church home, you're a very successful person. You're married, you had children and a career and raising children and all that sort of thing. But there would still be times where you would sort of miss that old lifestyle. So walk us through sort of the process where, because it seemed like you still hadn't really come to terms with your relationship to Mary Baker Eddy, which might sound kind of strange to people, but I think it speaks to the hold that the larger than life persona that Mary Baker Eddy must have within the Christian Science world, right? I mean, in reading it, and tell me if I'm putting this wrongly, but there was kind of a hold that she almost personally continued to have on you. Formational was she in your thinking. So, what were kind of the next steps for you in really not only leaving Christian Science, because that had really already been done, certainly in your mind, but sort of being able to let go of the hold that she had on you, and then I kind of want to think about, the question of children in Christian Science, and because it seems like you had to kind of come to terms with your own childhood, I guess, in a certain way. So,
yeah. Mary Baker Eddy is not like a pastor. Mary Baker Eddy and all of these, Joseph Smith and all these people that are in the bigwigs in these cults, they all had supposedly a spiritual connection with God. In Eddy's case, she received the spiritual interpretation of the scriptures. They are considered, and she said they were divinely inspired, just like the Bible is divinely inspired. Even the bylaws of the church she created were divinely inspired. So when you're reading Mary Baker Eddy's words, you had her, they wouldn't admit it, but really she's on a par with Jesus Christ. So when you turn around and leave that religion, just think of, as a Christian, if you suddenly turned your back on Jesus and walked away and said, oh, no, he was wrong. Yeah. What would that do to you emotionally? Well, it's the same kind of issue, especially if you're raised in one of these cults, because as a child, your emotions, your psyche, and everything is developed around this person being a spiritual leader. So as an adult, I can intellectually say, okay, I know it's wrong. I know it was a misinterpretation. Whether or not she was a good or bad person, the bottom line is she was mistaken, and I'm going to turn and I'm going to go to biblical truth. But in your formative years, you attached emotions to your memories, and so in your mind you can turn and walk away, but in your emotions you can't do it necessarily. Yeah. And you have to sort of go back to that place in your mind and work through that. And in my case, it turned out that there was this little piece of me that just couldn't let go. And so when I would talk about Christian Science, you've heard of the inner child. We all have times you feel like a little kid. You have times you have mixed emotions. There's a part of you that isn't necessarily always integrated with the rest of what you're thinking. In my case, that little childhood part of me that felt like a kid was still fiercely into Christian Science. And so I had to educate myself into, okay, what was Mary Baker Eddy really like? And in reading, what some of her closest followers said about her, and in studying mind control theory, okay, how do you make somebody believe something that isn't necessarily logical? You change the meaning of words. You control the information that they receive from the external. You control the way they think from the internal. You have your own language that changes the meanings of words, that makes it hard to talk to outsiders and really understand what each other is saying. You make it hard to leave the group, and that there'll be some danger if you leave. In Christian Science, it's if you open yourself up to the belief in the material world, you will suffer the consequences of illness or whatever. So I had to educate myself about all that sort of thing, and I had to sort of let that emotional child part of myself see Mary Baker Eddy for who she really was. And as I began to understand how this mind bending works, and read about what her closest followers in her day, how they reacted to her, and the things they thought were logical that from an outsider I can see that was ridiculous, that was not logical, then that little part of me, that little childhood part of me, began to recognize Mary Baker Eddy not as this great spiritual leader, but a little bit as a shyster, as a cult leader.
Yeah.
And then I was able, that part of me was able to let go of her. But then you have the added complication of a child. All children need, when they're little kids, they fall down, they bump their knee, they go to mommy or daddy, and mommy or daddy kisses the knee and says, "Ooh, I love you," and the kiss makes it all better. Well, whether or not it does, to the child, the kiss is making it better because they needed the emotional validation. A Christian Science child falls down, bumps their knee, they go to their mom or dad, and their mom or dad may or may not kiss them, but they'll say, "We both know that you're the perfect spiritual idea of God. This is no part of you. You're fine. Go play. You're not really hurt." Well, no matter how much love that is said with, that little kid needed their parent to say, "Ooh, I see you're hurt. I acknowledge it, and I love you."
Right.
And then
kiss it and make it better.
As a child, you don't get that. I had parents who were very loving. I was in a great family, and I could talk to them down to earth, but when we'd get to the end of any conversation, my dad very lovingly would say, "But we both know that this is no part of you." And any emotional validation that I had gotten from the conversation, I would then have to spiritualize it away because, I know that there's really not a problem.
Wow.
And so you end up with all this collective emotional neglect and damage growing up as a child in a very loving situation, or maybe not, but even in a loving situation, you've never been able to fully internalize the emotional nurturing that you needed as a child. And so there was a lot of baggage to undo, to acknowledge as an adult, having to work through those emotions and realize why certain things were bothering me.
Right. Wow.
And the way I did it was I had little children at the time, and I looked at them and I said, okay, what do my 4-year-olds and my 6-year-olds and my 12-year-old need? What as children do they need? And I started watching them and watching their friends, and I found that the things that they needed, this part of me that was aching, needed the exact same thing. So there was just this part of me that would never receive the nurturing I needed at a gut level as a child. And as I recognized that, then I was able to acknowledge those needs and, in a sense, self-nurture that child to health.
Yeah. How often, if any, I have 2 children, they're 4 and 6, and how often have they come to me? And they're really not in pain. Sometimes they genuinely really do hurt themselves, but a lot of times they cry quickly. They want to be validated. And, there are times when I have to say, okay, come on, get over it. You just, it doesn't hurt that bad. But there are other times where you just say, look, let's kiss it and make it better, and then let's move on. But they just need that validation. And then you have other stories, you hear about the kids that, the wild children whose parents never discipline so that the child grows up not knowing any boundaries, not knowing any borders, and they constantly are getting in trouble because they're waiting for someone to pay attention to them,
Exactly.
And, and that's the only way they can get attention is by being bad. And
they're looking for their boundaries.
Yeah. And so it just seems like the height, and I know it's well-intentioned, and I don't mean to sound this in a judgmental way, but it just seems like the height of cruelty to say to a child, the thing that you are so obviously experiencing isn't real. And, I know that it's said because they really do believe this particular philosophical or religious worldview, and I understand that, and I'm not judging or condemning, but children need that. They need that psychological validation from parents. That is what helps make a person healthy and whole is to be validated, is to be valued. And no, I'm not getting into the self-esteem movement, and that can be taken to extremes, of course. But it just seems this is really what I was alluding to earlier, the damage that can come to children, and I don't think it really ever sunk in, even though I've studied Christian Science in the past, but until I read your story, it really didn't sink in how damaging that could be to a child when you have to tell a child that they're a broken bone or, a cut that needs stitches or something, isn't real.
The tragedy, other than the spiritual tragedies, but the great tragedy of the Christian Science culture or lifestyle or whatever is that most Christian scientists are loving, caring,
Sure.
want to do the right thing people.
Yeah.
And they do so much damage to themselves and each other by trying to spiritualize their thinking that this great pool of love is misused. And so there's so much damage that gets done, and they don't mean to. And that, to me, is such a tragedy.
Yeah.
And I have a story, the people that are most heavily into it, the practitioners who are there, if you really are having trouble getting a healing, you can actually pay a practitioner who can help you get a healing by helping you clear your thinking and things like that. So the people that are sort of most high in the Christian Science movement, the teachers and the practitioners, are often some of the worst people for damage because they're so spiritual in their thinking that they do a lot of physical and emotional and spiritual damage. I was on a ski trip with a bunch of Christian Science kids. It wasn't sponsored by the church, but there was a youth group that was Christian Science youth group. Mm-hmm. And we went on this trip when I was in high school, and I fell skiing, and I really badly damaged my ankle. And they peeled me off the mountain screaming, and I was in terrible pain, and took a long time to get my boot off and all this. Well, there was a practitioner along who was very, very renowned, and he was one of the chaperones, and so he came over and sat next to me. And we knew the truth of the unreality of the situation and the perfect spiritual idea of God. So within a few minutes, he said, "Shall we take a walk?" And we put my regular snow boot back on, and he walked me up and down the mountain road with this horribly sprained ankle. And as we're doing it, I'm in excruciating pain, but we're knowing the truth. We're defying the seeming reality of the situation. Well, it took a long time for my ankle to heal. It was 20 years later. I was on anti-inflammatories for quite a long time for a different reason, and finally the residual pain went away. But it took like 20 years.
Wow.
So and he was doing what he thought was right, and I was wanting the healing, and I was trying to learn from the guy. So, I was going along with it because I was going to grow spiritually because of what this man was teaching me by what he was saying and what we were doing. So you want the healing, you want the spiritual growth, and you're taught that, okay, you can go to a doctor if you want to. There's nothing to keep you from going to a doctor except that it's going to damage your spiritual growth. And so there's a price to pay for going to the doctor because it's going to make things more difficult in your spiritual walk. Wow.
We only have about 5 or 6 minutes, so and there's a ton of questions I'm not going to be able to get to. So
let me, before we run out of time, the website you gave, christianway.org, is a great website for doctrinal differences. There's a lot of what does Christian Science say, what does the Bible say. There's a lot of personal stories and resources and all that. There's also a new ministry that's you can find it's called the Fellowship of Former Christian Scientists, and their website is ffcsministry.org, and they have Google Hangouts, and they have it's a relational ministry where it's a good place to go if you need some hanging out with people either in person or over the web who can understand your spiritual recovery that you're going through. So if you're a former Christian Scientist or if you're struggling with it and you need help, either christianway.org or ffcsministry.org are good places to go.
Great. Okay, well, let me ask 2 quick questions. One is, you mentioned that there's kind of a relationship between the way of thinking in Christian Science and the prosperity gospel that is sort of a dredge on the church today. If dredge is a word, I think it's a dreg. Anyway, would you comment on that briefly? Because I think that would be a really interesting area for further study.
the idea if you have enough faith, God will give you what you want. It's almost in Christian science. In Christian science, they teach you if you understand well enough, you will get your healing because you will demonstrate what really is. In the Name It, Claim It prosperity gospel, it's if you have enough faith, God will bless.
Yeah.
It's almost like God is obligated to do this thing.
God is up there waiting for you to change His mind. That's basically what they say.
Right. It's kind of blasphemous if you think about it.
Well, it really is. I think that's fair because, God is sovereign the last time I checked, and God was free to do what God wanted. And, the idea that God is just waiting to bless you, He's waiting to bring you prosperity, but you have to unleash. It's like your faith has to unleash His, and word faith. I mean, your words can essentially change God's mind, and of course, when people fail, it's like they're told the same thing that people are told in Christian Science, right?
Exactly, it's your fault. If you didn't get your healing, if you didn't get your prosperity, it's your fault because you didn't have enough faith.
Well, and what the word that needs to be clearly spoken to both groups is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And what struck me in reading your story again and kind of relearning about Christian Science is that the gospel of and actually we had a conversation with a debater we brought into town for our church this weekend. I was reminded of this element of the gospel. Christians often think that the sole goal of the Christian worldview, the Christian life, is to get to heaven. And a lot of Christians, and this isn't helped, by the way, by all the movies about after-death experiences and all that, but they sort of think of heaven as an angelic realm where they will essentially become angels, and we won't become angels. They're a different kind of created being. But anyway, we're all sort of floating on clouds. We're immaterial, we're playing harps, we're having a good old time, and I really don't think that's what heaven is. The Bible speaks of a new heavens and a new earth, but more to the point for what we're talking about today, a resurrected body. And the resurrection of Jesus is the prototype, the first fruit of creation, but it's the prototype of the resurrected body. And what does He say to Thomas? Put your hand here, feel my wounds, feel the wound in my flesh, and so forth. And so that is the body that we'll get. It's an incorruptible body, it's a sinless body, but it is a material body. And it just seems like that is really good news to a people in particular who, first of all, dealing with the prosperity gospel, people who are always looking for something better in this life because they're not content with what God has provided and what God ultimately will provide. But of course, in Christian Science, for people who have to deny the reality of the body.
Yeah, exactly. And you think about it. If you say that the body's bad, or if it's God created matter. Yeah. And why wouldn't you accept that gift? Right.
Yeah, and even matter post fall, even matter stained with sin is still good. There's still good in the creation, and so yeah, I don't know. Let me ask just one more question then. I mean, this is tied to that. What has the gospel of justification meant for you? The gospel that Jesus died for sins, that He was risen on the third day, that these things are real. That's a big question, but what has it meant for you?
My first pastor, once I'd come out of Christian Science, as I was working through a lot of emotional things, he said to me one day, "How does it make you feel to know that you're a sinner?" And I said, "It feels great." And he was a little surprised because I don't have to be perfect. I'm not having to deny imperfections, and I can be who I am, and I know that what I am is imperfect, but that's okay because Jesus has dealt with that issue through His death and resurrection on the cross, and my job is to follow Jesus. My job is not to be perfect. Yeah. And that is very, very releasing.
Right. Well, folks, I appreciate you tuning into the Sin Boldly program today. It'll be put out as a podcast through our church website if you'd like to listen to this and other other shows. That website is felchouston.org. Go to kpft.org. Support what KPFT does there. It's as you can tell, it's commercial-free, listener-supported radio, and we get to talk about all sorts of interesting things. So do go to kpft.org. We mentioned two websites as well, christianway.org and ffcsministry.org. Check those out to learn more about Christian Science. And Linda, stay on the phone, okay?
Okay.
But folks, until next week, where I'll be back, may you have the peace that passes all understanding. See ya.